TypeORM supports the repository design pattern. This means that each entity we create has its own repository. The repository class available from TypeORM acts as an abstraction over our data source and exposes a variety of useful methods to interact with the records stored in our database. Since we've already registered coffee entity in the scope of our coffee module, we now have the ability to inject the automatically generated repository into our coffee service using the inject repository decorator exported from nest.js/typeorm package. Previously in our coffee service, we used the coffees array as our mock in-memory data source. Since we're using a real database now, we no longer need this mock implementation, so let's remove it. Let's go inside each method one by one, replacing our mock data interactions, and use our new coffee repository. Before we dive into everything here, know that we will be using a JavaScript feature called async await. If you aren't familiar with it, async await makes promises easier to manage and much more readable. We'll need to update most of our methods here to be async in order for this to work. Let's start things off by looking at the findAll method. Let's remove the current code inside the method and try to use our new coffee repository. Let's add return this.coffee repository and hit period to see what kind of methods are available to us from this TypeORM repository. As we can see, there is a vast variety of methods available to us to handle almost any interaction with our data. We need to find all coffees. So in our case, let's use the find method here. Next, let's update find1. First, let's add async before the method name. Inside the method, let's replace the existing mock code and use the repository method find1, making sure to pass in the ID. Since find1 here returns a promise, let's await the result. Next, our create method. Let's replace the old code with the following and break it down line by line. The first thing we need to do for this method is to create a coffee class instance based on our partial DTO and save it to the variable coffee. Now that we have an instance of coffee created, all we need to do is call the save method, which returns a promise, and our new entity will be saved to the database. Also, let's make sure to replace createCoffeeDTO of type any with the appropriate type createCoffeeDTO, which will now give us full type safety here as well. Now on to update. First, let's add async again before the method name, and let's replace the existing code with the following. Let's break everything down line by line again so we understand everything that's happening here. First, we're using a new repository method called preload. This method creates a new entity based on the object passed into it. Preload first looks to see if an entity already exists in the database, and if so, retrieves it and everything related to it. If an entity exists already, preload replaces all of the values with the new ones passed in here in our update coffee DTO. Note the preload method will return undefined if the ID of the entity passed in was not found in the database. For this reason, let's make sure we always test whether the result is undefined, and if so, you can see we're throwing a not found exception here. To finish everything off, let's make sure we save our changes to the database by calling the repository save method. Just like we did in our create method a moment ago, we can also replace that type any in the parameters to use our update coffee DTO, making us fully type safe here as well. And that's it for our update method. Next up, we have the remove method. Let's replace the existing code with the following and break it down. We need to retrieve the coffee, and if it exists, remove it from the database. To achieve this, we can call the find1 method that's within this service, passing in the ID. Once we have the entity, all we need to do is call the repository remove method, which returns a promise, and make sure we pass in the coffee entity we just received. We don't need to throw any errors manually if coffee does not exist, because the find1 method in our service automatically handles that for us. And just like that, with a few lines of code in our service, we've set up an entire CRUD workflow for our coffee entity. We've managed to quickly migrate all of our methods to use our real database now too. Let's fire up Insomnia and test some of these routes to make sure everything works. Let's start by making a few post requests to populate some entries in the coffee table. Make sure to change a property or two in each request payload so they're all slightly different in the database. Now that we have a few entries in our table, let's make a GET request to /coffees and see if we get data back from the database. Great, everything works so far. Next, let's test the patch endpoint and update the first coffee with ID 1. Let's change the endpoint we want to hit to coffee/1. And for our body payload, let's pass in an object with a different name. In our case, we're going to update the name to coffee updated. Once we hit send, we should see it worked. Our patch endpoint actually returned the newly updated entity back from the database for us. Let's make sure it really did make those changes by making a GET request for coffee/1 to double check. Perfect, we can see it really did update the name for that coffee. Lastly, let's make sure delete works by removing this item from the database. If we switch Insomnia to make a delete request for the same ID of 1, once we push send, we should see that everything looks okay. No errors. So far so good. But let's do one more GET request to make sure that it's really gone. When we push send, we should see a 404 not found message come back. It worked. The item is really gone now. So just like that, we have everything working perfectly. We're using a real database now, and we've managed to hit a lot of fundamental aspects of TypeORM and integrating it with our Nest applications. Our app is really starting to take shape now.